Hi kids, and welcome to the second in a series of podcasts on evolution. This one focuses more on natural selection. Now, natural selection was the big idea that Charles Darwin had, and it's his contribution to the idea of evolution. Let's remember that evolution is considered by biologists to be a fact. Organisms do change over time. The theory is how they actually change over time. Charles Darwin was the first one to suggest this idea that natural selection is the process by which organisms change. In other words, nature determines which organisms will survive and which ones will become extinct. So a little bit about Charles Darwin. He was born the same day as Abraham Lincoln in 1809. But unlike Lincoln, he was born into a privileged family. His father was a physician in Europe, so he was allowed to go to the best schools. Charles Darwin was an average student. His passion lied in biological sciences, so that's where he got most of his background. The science of the time was geology, the study of the earth, the forces that shape it, as well as determining the age of the earth. So a lot of his influences came from geology. In his early 20s, he was invited to sail the world on sailing ship, the HMS Beagle. The HMS Beagle was charged with circumnavigating the globe and mapping it for Britain and hopefully discovering some resources that Britain could use for their government. Charles Darwin was considered the ship's naturalist. He was to look for different species of organisms and take notes on them. On the trip, he was really struck with the different types of organisms that he had never seen before. He collected lots of them, had them shipped back to Europe for further study. And what he noticed is that as he traveled, especially around South America, that organisms had a lot of similarity. He noticed that species of organisms resembled one another. He returned from his 5-year trip in 1836, but it wasn't until 1859 that he published his idea of natural selection in the famous book On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection. It caused quite a stir at the time, but all of the discoveries that have been done since then have supported this idea of natural selection. So his theory is very well supported over time. And it's still considered the best explanation for how organisms change over time. To understand natural selection a little bit better, you have to start with a population of organisms in which there are variations. Remember, variation is referring to a particular trait and the different forms of that trait. Remember, we talked about eye color and hair color. Those are traits. But the variations could be, for example, in eye color, blue eyes, brown eyes, or green eyes. So those are variations within a trait. So nearly every trait has variations. In order for natural selection to occur, there has to be a change in the environment. And the change in the environment may allow some individuals with a particular variation in a trait to be better suited to the environment. For example, individuals with that trait, we say, have higher fitness. And because they have higher fitness, they live longer and have more offspring that look like them. So they pass that variation on to their offspring. Those that have a different variation that's not suited to the environment, we say have lower fitness. Those individuals are going to die, and their genes die out of the population. So the high-fit individuals have those variations. Those variations become what we call adaptations. An adaptation is a trait that makes an individual more suited to its environment. So more of those individuals reproduce, and the population becomes better suited to its environment. And that's how natural selection works. Here's an example. Let's pretend that the colored dots here represent a population of bacteria. And the different colors represent a variation in their resistance to an antibiotic. Antibiotics are used to kill bacteria, especially bacterial infections. Now, it is known that bacteria do have different levels of resistance, even within a population of a species. The light color in this picture represents those that have low resistance to an antibiotic, while the darker reddish color means that they have higher resistance. So if these bacteria are exposed to an antibiotic, those with the light color will die and therefore not be able to reproduce. Okay? And only those with the reddish color will survive. We say that they have higher fitness, and so the new population is replaced with those that are more like it. It's better adapted to the environment, and so we say that the population has evolved. We call this microevolution only because the population has changed, and it involves a change in what we call the gene pool. No longer is there the variation that you see in the coloration, or in this case, the resistance level. The gene pool is changed to favor a particular variation, and that's called microevolution. Remember, fitness is equal to reproductive success. A famous observation on microevolution was done by a biologist by the name of Ketwell, who lived in Europe in the early parts of the 1900s. He studied data on the population of a particular moth called the peppered moth, and you can see why it was called the peppered moth. Most of these moths had this peppered appearance that gave it some good camouflage in its environment, especially in the 1800s. Most of the moths look like this. You could occasionally find some that were darker in color, but the peppered appearance gave those that were more peppered an advantage in its environment in the early 1800s, because you can barely see it here, and I'll outline it in red for you. The advantage was because there was a predator that would eat these birds. And the moths hung out on this light colored bark, and so the moth-eating bird would see the dark one. Now, the dark ones weren't completely eaten out of existence. Some of them would land on a darker part of the bark, and so some of the genes for this dark colored stayed in the population. But nonetheless, most of the moths were this peppered color. And so we would say that the peppered colored moth had higher fitness during that period of time. Well, something happened to the environment during the Industrial Revolution. This is a time when an awful lot of coal was being burned in Europe, and that produced a lot of coal dust in the atmosphere that landed on, in this instance, the moth's habitat. It liked to land on the bark, and so now with the darker bark, the environment had changed. In this case, it favored the dark-colored moth. The dark-colored moth had higher fitness, and the lighter-colored moth had lower fitness because the moth-eating bird was able to see it. The entire population had changed. Again, we had microevolution. And so there was a change in the population. So in summary, natural selection is basically defined as differential reproductive success. Some individuals in a population are going to be more successful at passing their genes on to the next generation than others, and those traits will be what the next population has. So each individual in a population is made a little bit differently. If some of those differences make the individual better to survive, then those individuals have high fitness and pass those genes on to the next generation. The next generation is then better adapted to the environment. That's the end of my explanation of evolution by natural selection. I hope this helps you understand it. We'll see you back in class.